lousy technique. I would say get your books. We're doing a lot of things different this morning. We're going to sing Jesus Saves. If you need a mental image, it's number 10 in the hymn book. We have heard the joyful song, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Spread the tidings all around, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Bear the news to every land, climb the steeps and cross the waves. Onward 'tis our Lord's command, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Who acted on the rolling tide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Tell to sinners far and wide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing ye islands of the sea, echo back ye ocean caves. Her shall keep her jubilee, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing above the battle strife, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. By his death and endless life, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing it softly through the gloom, when the heart for mercy craves. Sing in triumph for the tomb, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Give the winds a mighty voice, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Let the nations now rejoice, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Shout salvation full and free, highest hills and deepest caves. This a song of victory, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Turn it off.
Just wipe her down real quick. Thank you.
You're welcome.
See if I can get this on right. Is it on? Can everyone hear me? Sound good? All right. So, if I had planned about this a little bit better, I would have asked everybody to do it earlier. But one of the things I do want to announce to everyone, if you do like this, if you would like to continue doing this for morning services, other services as well, just afterwards, text me or call me, let me know. And we will continue with this, keep doing it if everybody wants to. As I've already mentioned, I am attempting to record this stuff, so hopefully we'll be able to, if the recording, if my phone cooperates, technology cooperates, I'll have it online for those that can't make it. But if you'd like to continue doing this, please let me know. If you have some suggestions on how to improve it, let me know as well. And we'll keep doing this until we're able to assemble normally. And also, you know, ahead of time, let me know of any prayer requests or blessings that you have, and I'll announce those as well. Just so that we do have one blessing, because I've got to share it with everyone. We did get married this past weekend. So as everyone has noticed, there is something on my hand now. We decided, actually, we were wanting to do it this weekend, but the weather would not tell us what it was going to do. And so we had to just we didn't know that we were going to do it. We did it Friday afternoon at about, I think this ceremony ended up being about 2:30 or 3. And we decided that we were going to do it at 10 o'clock Friday morning. The weather had been telling us that Saturday was going to be the day, and then on Friday the weather decided that Friday was the day, and so we went ahead and did it on Friday. and ended up working great because, as everyone noticed, I'm sure it was beautiful Friday and then rained all day Saturday. So it really worked out. You know, we're really good, although the first night she woke me up because of a dream where I wasn't breathing and she had to make sure I was breathing. The way I woke up was her beating on my chest. So we've already had our dream excitement, I guess. So that was exciting, being woke up to my new wife beating me on the chest saying you're not breathing, whenever, as I was saying, I am breathing.
Because I'm a nurse.
She says it's because she's a nurse, but I don't know, did that ever happen to you, Brother Jim? But yes, it was a really big blessing. As we've been trying to let everybody know, we will still be having a reception. Right now it's planned for May 22nd. If we're allowed to have it then, we will. If not, we'll plan it for another day. So everyone will still be able to celebrate with us at a later time. We just got tired of waiting and didn't know what was going to happen. So I'd ask that you would pray for us as well as we start our journey together. And just as we continue with that, continue to pray for each other during this time. Pray for others that even that are not a part of our church that this is affecting. Even though things are starting to look up, there's still a long ways to go, and people are still hurting and still having trouble with this. And it's still hard, even though it's nice to be here today with everybody, it's not the same. And it would be great if we can be able to do this again, and just to be able to enjoy our time together. But we're going to be this morning in Job. I hope that you've been watching our videos I've been putting on YouTube. Last week we started a new series on Sunday mornings that I titled Surviving the Plague. I thought it was an applicable thing for us to be looking at, and we're going to be going through the book of Job, and not every bit of it. This is probably going to be a 4 or 5 week study, but we're going to be looking at the events that unfolded in Job's life and the things that took place there, and look at how it applies to us and dealing with problems in our lives, or even as we are right now in a pandemic that has taken place, and how to respond to them. Last week, what we looked at was preparing for the plague, and one of the things I mentioned was that preparation for the plague is a little bit late for this one specifically. But we are guaranteed that there are going to be problems in our lives, that things aren't going to be perfect. Nowhere in Scripture does it promise that life is going to be perfect for a believer. It doesn't say that. Now, it'll tell us that we will be blessed in different ways. It promises us spiritual strength. It promises us joy. It does not promise us physical blessings, although those can be the blessings that God provides for us. But it does, in other places, actually tell us that in following the Lord, things may actually be harder for us. That there may be other problems that we will have to experience because of our relationship with Christ. And so there's going to be problems, and it's going to continue happening, because until Christ returns, there is always going to be sin in this world. And that sin is going to cause problems, and we are going to have our own versions of plagues or trials or tribulations, whatever name you want to give it. And so this is something that is going to happen again. And so it's important for us to maybe when this came along, you weren't as prepared as you needed to be emotionally or in your relationship with Christ. You weren't as prepared as you needed to be. And so next time, whenever all of this gets better and things are going smoother, you can prepare for the next set of problems that come in your life. But then the thing to remember is, with this preparation, what it does, and I mentioned it last week as well, is that it gives us the tools and it gives us the habits that also make it stronger for us, make it easier for us to endure it, because we are already doing the things. So what we're going to be looking at this week is, in surviving the plague, is we need to stay focused. We need to have the correct focus. We need to be focusing in on the correct things. And this is how the preparation goes, because some of the things that we're going to look at, we also discussed last week in our message, because they were things that already existed in Job's life, and he continued with them. Now, if you are not continuing with them, it's good to start them. But if you are already doing them, if you're already walking in these things, it makes it that much easier to continue in these things during your life, because you're not having to start them. But these things are still, can be used, can be brought into our lives to help us in dealing with these problems and continuing to stay strong. And so we're going to look today, and we're going to be skipping around quite a bit. But for our text, I want us to look at Job chapter 1. And we're going to be looking in Job chapter 1 and 2 this morning. But for our text, I want us to go ahead and look in Job chapter 1. And verse 20, it says, "Then Job arose and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly." Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for giving us this ability to come here this beautiful day as well, to gather together, and to just, even though we are spread out, we're still able to assemble together as a group, and to at least see each other from afar off. Lord, I pray you help us to be encouraged by this and to remain strong in the remainder of our time apart. Please just open our hearts right now to your word as we are studying it. Apply it to our hearts, Lord, and help us to really grow, to use this so that we can grow during this time, and grow at any point in time, Lord. I'd ask that you would guide me and bring remembrance to things that I've studied, I've learned in this time, that everything that we do here today, this time that we spend, would be for your glory, your honor, and your will. In Jesus' name, amen. So the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at what Job's plagues were, and what happened to Job. And if you go over to chapter 1, and we're going to be looking, starting in verse well, let's go ahead and get some context with this. What we have here is Satan and the Lord having a conversation, Satan making a request. So let's go ahead and start in verse 6, just so we have the context of it. In chapter 1 of Job, in verse 6, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? That there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job, and said, The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them. And the Sabines fell upon them, and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep, and the servants, and consumed them. and I only am escaped to tell thee. And while he is yet speaking, there came also another, and said, The Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. What I see here is the first round of problems that Satan inflicts upon Job. And what takes place is basically all of his livestock and his servants, and then also his children, all of them are taken away from him at this time. And if we notice here, it actually all happens, or Job receives the news of all of this just one after another, because it tells us that a servant comes, tells him, hey, you've lost this, and then as soon as that servant ends, another servant comes and says, hey, you've lost this, and then another comes and says, you've lost this, and then finally another comes and says, you have lost all of your children. And all of this came one after another. And it's kind of interesting with the COVID stuff taking place, that it really seems like it kind of came just one after another with everything that's coming on. At least for me, I don't spend a lot of time on watching the news, but with me it seemed like one day it was saying, it's actually, we were going back to Oklahoma for a wedding shower, and on the way there we were thinking, man, this is crazy, people are overreacting, this is just, what's going on here? And then as we were coming back 2 days later, we were thinking, well, this might be a little serious. On Sunday, I was thinking we're not going to have to cancel services, we'll be able to continue. And by Wednesday, we had canceled services for, or at least the assembling together for the immediate future. It just seemed within a week we went from everything being fine to everything being locked down and problems everywhere. And there are a lot of times that things happen to us in this way, where we're just going along and then bam, one after another things come. We have the phrase, when it rains, it pours. And that's what it seems like happens a lot of times. And this is what happened to Job. These things, they just came one after another. It just everything falling down. And we're going to come back to his response to it. But I also want us to look at the other thing that happened to Satan, or happened to Job afterwards. In chapter 2, in verses 7 and 8, we see that another thing happened to Job later on. It says, So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. What I see here is the last thing to happen to Job is that he is inflicted from head to toe with sores. Something about this is there are a lot of differing opinions on exactly what disease that Job had, exactly what happened to him. And, my personal opinion with this is that there may be some things that were in common to diseases that we know of today. But to some extent, I think that since this was one that was inflicted by Satan himself onto Job, that it was probably at the very least a very extreme case of something that we have today, or maybe even something that was just concocted for Job himself. But in the book of Job, we do have some information that is given about this. The first thing that we see in chapter 2 is that it covers his body from head to toe. Every single inch of his body was covered with this skin disease. And what we also see with this is that it causes an intense itching to happen, because we see in verse 8 it says, And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal. This word potsherd basically means a broken piece of pottery. Basically, he had a broken piece of pottery that he used to scratch himself because his skin itched so intensely that was the only thing that could give him relief, was to scrape him with that. I've had some pretty intense itchings in certain areas but just maybe my arm or my legs. But I never had the desire to dig at my skin with a piece of clay. But Job had this throughout his entire body. And later on in Job, we actually have some indication of some other things that came from this. If you turn over to chapter 7, in Job chapter 7, we're given two other things that happened because of this. In verse 5, it tells us of Job chapter 7, my flesh is clothed with worms and clouds of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. Basically, what happens here is he has ulcers and maggots or worms digging into his skin, just covering him. And then a little bit later in verse 14, it says, then thou scarest me with dreams and terrifiest me through visions. What we actually see is that it even has a mental effect on his sleep patterns, because he's unable to sleep because of intense nightmares even. And then if you turn over to Job chapter 30, we're given a couple other things about it. Job chapter 30. So he has worms and probably maggots and then ulcers as well. He has intense nightmares. And now in chapter 30 in verse 17, he says, my bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. He had intense achings within his bones. His bones were even eroding away at him. So it was not just his skin, but his bones even were having an effect. And then later on in verse 30, he says, my skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. He talks more about the intense burning within his bones, but he also talks about his skin being black. And his skin now not only has the ulcers and the maggots, but it is also it does not look good either. It is dying, and some even believe maybe it was just falling off of him. So Job was probably a very uneasy sight with the things that were taking place on him, and the effect of all of this. He did not have any comfort at all. And we look around him, well, the effects that can take place on somebody that contracts the COVID disease, or virus. We look at those, and those are very serious for some. And Job here is going through this. I think there were probably times that he was starting to really consider letting things go. But we see, at least at this point in time, that that's not Job's outlook. We're going to look later on in other weeks at a little bit of Job questioning things. But right now he stands very firm, and we're going to look at the things that kept him focused in the right way, that kept him focused on the Lord, that kept him strong during this time. Because I think they can be very beneficial for us to know as well. And the first thing that I want us to see some characteristics that are a signal of Job's focused heart. Job's focused heart. And I want us to notice some of these. I'm going to point out that these already existed previously in Paul's life. Or not Paul, Job's life. There were already things that he was doing and he was working on in his life. And as I mentioned before with the preparation, that if we are already doing these things, when things are nice, when things are going smoothly, it makes it much easier to continue them while we are in the hard times, while we are experiencing the trials. Because what happens many times is people want to, when things are easy, when things are flowing smoothly, we forget to keep strengthening ourselves. We forget to keep working with the Lord and to keep growing our relationship with Him, and to remain focused truly And then when problems come, we have trouble finding the things that the Lord has for us to grow through, the things that the Lord has for us to stand firm in. And so if we already have these things, it makes it much easier. But we can also start these things while we have the problems, and it will bring us closer to the Lord. So the first thing that we're going to see with Job's focused heart is that his first response was to honor the name of God. If you look in chapter 1 of Job, and verse 21, it says, and he said, Job, he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What I see here is that Job's first response, and this is before the sores on his skin, but it is after he has lost all of his livestock, all of his family except for his wife, and all of his servants. He has nothing. His first response is to fall down and to worship the Lord. It says quite clearly in verse 20 that he worshiped him. And he even blessed the name of the Lord. What he's realizing here, what he's bringing mention to, is that the Lord is in control of his life. That the Lord is the one that is there. That the Lord controls his riches. And he mentions others that, if you look down in chapter 2 and verse 10, he mentions more on this same topic of the Lord being in complete control. He says in verse 10 of chapter 2, he says, but he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God? Shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. When he mentions here, what shall we receive good at the hand of God? And then he says, shall we not receive evil? Basically he's saying, everything that I had that was good, every way that I was blessed, this was from the Lord. It was from the Lord deciding to give it to me, and the Lord thinking that this was for me to have. And it's also the Lord's to decide to take it away from me. It's also for the Lord to decide what is best for me. I do not decide what is best for me. I do not decide what is in my best interest. The Lord decides those things. The Lord is the one that has control of that. And I think many times, whenever things are going very smooth and we have many areas that we are blessed, what naturally happens is that we forget that it is from the Lord that gives it to us. That the Lord is the one that provides it to us. We start to think that I have accomplished great things. I have done amazing things. And then whenever everything is taken away from us, we get very mad because we think everything that we have worked for, God has just taken away unjustly. That He has just taken away something that He had no right to control. That it was not for Him to decide. And because of that mindset that it is ours, not God's, we get very mad at Him because we feel like He stole something from us. But Job, however, he remembers that it is all God's, not his. And so he is more wanting his heart, his mind is focused on the Lord. His response is to worship God. Because he's following the Lord, not his riches. His heart is focused on God, not on his wealth. So he blesses God. He thanks the Lord for what he's done. You know, some, they get mad when God takes things away, but some even think that whenever everything disappears, when things get hard, that means that God is gone, that he's not there. Many in times of great problems will look around and they will say, where is God? Why did he not prevent this? Why did he let this happen? Is he even there? But whenever our focus is on the Lord and trusting Him, when we are more focused on wanting to worship Him, not being focused on our own things, we realize that He is still there. He is still in control. And we're able to trust Him. We're able to follow Him. Because He's our focus. So Job, because his focus was on the Lord, not on his riches, he decided to trust God instead of get mad or wonder if He was gone. He trusted the Lord with his life. The next thing I want us to see with Job, the condition of his heart after this, is that he continued to eschew evil, or to avoid evil. If you look in chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? That there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. And still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause." What we see in the first few verses of chapter 2 is it's basically the same conversation between God and Satan as what took place in Job chapter 1. Except for Satan basically says afterwards that, you haven't let me take affecting of Job's life itself. You just let me take stuff away around him. If you allow me to touch Job himself, if you allow me to do something to Job's life itself, then Job will hate you. Then Job will leave you. But what God says to Job right now, before this, but after the first set of plagues, He says that he is a perfect and upright man. He eschewed evil. He avoided evil. And last week when we talked about the avoiding evil, that it is a heart condition that you want to flee that. It's your heart that makes you to want to run away from that, to avoid that. We see it in Job chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, "There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil." We see that he was already doing this. It's something that was already taking place in his life, and he continued with it. It is interesting on the topic of continuing of things. What happens many times, people that receive bad things, instead of continuing their relationship with God and continuing to follow Him, because of the things that go wrong, that is an excuse for them to leave God. That is an excuse for them to stop following the Lord. But Job continues with it. He continued to avoid the evil. The second thing I want us to see about what Job continued was Job had focused actions. He had focused actions. Not only did Job have a focused heart, but he wasn't sitting around having a pity party. He was still doing the things that he needed to be doing. We see, as we've already looked in verse 20, that it says that Job arose, rent his mantle, shaved his head, and fell down on the ground and worshipped. We see that the action that Job takes is to humbly approach God and worship Him, to seek Him. That's his response. That's the action that he does. It keeps him focused on the Lord. It keeps his actions from being things that tears him away from God, that takes his focus away from what is right. And then as we see in verse 3 of chapter 2, we also see that God tells Satan that he is still, he says, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? And still he holdeth fast his integrity, even though thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause." We see that he continues to do the perfect, complete things, to continue to do the upright things, the straight and narrow things. Even in verse 9, it says, then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thy integrity? Curse God and die. We even see that in the case of Job, that he is encouraged by his own wife to curse God and die. Now, this is something that's been pointed out to me before, and I always think about it. But in all the things that happened to Job, Satan was basically given free rein to do, by the end of this, was given free rein to do anything that he wanted to Job except for take Job's life. He took away all of his children, he took away all of his animals, all of his income. But he never takes Job's wife. And we're never told why, but with her statement here of basically telling Job, you need to curse God and just forget him and leave him behind. Why are you still worshiping God whenever he's not doing anything for you? It makes me wonder how good of a wife she really was. And if not, this was adding to Job's problems. But we see that he's even given this horrible advice to leave God, to give up his integrity, to give up his desire to follow him. And he doesn't. He stayed true to the Lord. We even see in verse 10, he says, but he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God? Shall we not receive evil? And all this did not Job sin with his lips. We see that Job's response to her is, a foolish woman, what are you speaking? And this term foolish woman basically means sinful woman. He's basically saying, you are a sinful woman with the things that you have just said here. You are acting as one of sinfulness. Why did you say that? It is for the Lord to decide these things. I'm going to continue being focused on God. Another thing I want us to see is that he proved the Lord's statement about his goodness. When you see in chapter 2 and verse 3 at the end, it says that, and still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. Now this phrase can be kind of confusing, but if you look over in chapter 1 and verse 9, it says, Satan answered the Lord and said, doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. What we see is that Satan comes and he requests the Lord, and he basically says, you know, the reason that Job follows you and the reason that Job does all this is because, well, you're giving him every good thing that you possibly can. You're protecting him from anything that could go wrong in his life. And Satan says, if you remove all of this, Job is going to curse you. Job is going to leave you. But what we see is that that doesn't happen. And this is what God is talking about in verse 3. When he says that he holdeth fast his integrity, and then he says, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. You know, Satan did not force God into anything. Basically what God was saying is, what you said about Job, that he's going to curse me if I remove this stuff from him so that you can inflict harm on him, that didn't actually happen. It wasn't actually true. You're wanting things to happen that they didn't have any cause. There wasn't anything with it. And God knew what was going to happen in all of this. None of this was a surprise. But what he's mentioning here is that Job is sticking hard to God. Job held his integrity. You know, many, when faced with adversity, when faced with problems, they fall into a tailspin. They leave the Lord, and they just go down so fast and so hard and cause so many more problems in their life. sometimes it can be a very minor thing in their life. But yet in the case of Job, he didn't allow himself to fall into a tailspin. He stood firm with the Lord. He stood tall. And then in verse 10 it says at the end, "In all this did not Job sin with his lips." I see is that even through all of this that happened, Job still did not speak evil towards the Lord. He still did not say things, still did not do things that were evil. And I want to encourage you during this to stand firm, stand tall during this time. Use the free time that you have not to sit and mope about, but to pull closer to the Lord. To keep doing the things that you're supposed to do. Don't get mad and leave the Lord. Don't get mad at Him for hurting something in your life or taking something away from you. Even other things that may happen in the future. Don't allow that to take place. Stand firm with it. When we hold on to these things, they'll keep us they make it much easier for us to endure. It'll even make it much easier to listen to the Lord when He provides us with advice, when He provides us with things that we need to correct, or things that we do need to continue in. Next week we are going to look at what we should be doing if we do happen to fall a little during this time, if we do begin to falter a little bit in our faith and following with the Lord. We're basically going to look at listening to the Lord's correction or guidance. Because none of us are perfect. And we may have some problems, but we need to be willing to listen to the Lord. And starting things off from the very beginning, whenever things go wrong, with focusing on the Lord. From continuing, making the decision to continue having a heart that's following God and continuing to have actions that are following the Lord will make listening to Him much easier and much more available to us. Not that the Lord is less likely to talk to us, but we are less likely able to listen to Him. So we're going to go ahead and have a word of prayer, and we will be done for this evening. Lord, I thank You for this day that You've given to us. I thank You for this time that we have to be in Your Word. I ask that You'd help us to learn from the life of Job, to hold on to You during this time, and to grow in our relationship with You during this time. That we would not be pulled down, we would not be worn thin, that we'd have a strong life in You. Just pray You keep us all safe as we return home and during all this time. Be with us whenever we are able to assemble again together. In Jesus' name, amen.